Welcome to the debate. You know, when you first learn to draw, you are almost always taught to rely on outlines.
Right.
You take a pencil and you draw this stark, dark line to separate the apple from the table it sits on. It is a clean, categorical, and honestly a highly comforting way to look at reality.
Yeah, you are constructing a universe of perfectly distinct entities.
Exactly. The apple ends exactly where the table begins. You have two distinct objects, and the boundary is absolute.
But as your technique progresses, like as you move away from simple sketches and into complex painting, you realize that stark pencil line doesn't actually exist anywhere in nature.
No, it really doesn't.
The light bouncing off the table colors the underside of the apple, and the shadow of the apple blends seamlessly into the grain of the wood on the table. The boundary is entirely porous. The colors just bleed into one another.
And suddenly, the distinct separation you relied on to make sense of your world becomes incredibly difficult to pin down. And that realization is exactly the threshold we are crossing today.
It is.
Does the boundary between you and the world actually exist, or is the stark line separating your mind from reality just a convenient illusion?
It's a massive question.
It is. We started in week 1 by dismantling the traditional machine model of the body. We looked at motor intentionality, that massive shift from a cognitive Cartesian I think to a bodily I can. We stopped treating the body as an interiorless thing piloted by a brain and realized that consciousness is fundamentally rooted in our physical capacity to move.
Yeah, and then in week 2, we unpacked practonosia, which is, a heavy term for skillful coping without explicit mental representation.
Such a crucial concept.
Definitely. We talked about the profound mechanism of the blind man's stick. When someone learns to use a cane, they aren't consciously calculating the vibrations in their palm and translating them into a mental map of the sidewalk. The cane physically ceases to be an object in their hand.
Right, it's incorporated directly into the body's sensory network.
Exactly. The person actually feels the street at the tip of the cane. The body inherently understands the movement required, completely bypassing the intellectual brain.
And last week, we built on that by looking at the body's constant, unreflective striving for a maximal grip on its environment. It's like when you look at a painting in a museum.
You naturally step forward, then step a little bit back.
Right. You find the exact optimal distance to view the art without ever doing any conscious math.
That striving establishes a basic bodily normativity, a felt sense of rightness and wrongness in our posture.
Which brings us to today.
Yes. Today, in week 4, we arrive at the culmination of these ideas, the intertwining of body and world. Merleau-Ponty uses the concepts of the intentional arc and the chiasm to argue that the body acts as a third term.
An ambiguous reality, exactly. An ambiguous reality that escapes the traditional categories of mind and matter, completely intertwining the subject with the world.
Which brings us to the core tension we have to address today. We have to ask, does Merleau-Ponty's concept of the flesh and the chiasm successfully resolve the Cartesian mind-body dualism to establish phenomenology as a rigorous science?
Or does it merely obscure the problem with poetic jargon and metaphorical ambiguity?
That is the question.
So here's the crucial problem, the real sticking point. Our own lived experience of our body, it just doesn't fit into this neat two-substance model. I mean, think about something as simple as catching a ball. Is that purely an object in motion following the laws of physics, or is it purely a conscious calculation of trajectory? No, of course not. It's something else entirely. Our body isn't just an object we happen to be observing, nor is it the pure consciousness doing the observing. This experience reveals a huge crack in the whole framework. And so, Merleau-Ponty proposes something pretty radical. He doesn't try to build a better bridge between mind and matter. No. He disrupts the entire dualism by introducing what he calls a third term, a whole new category of existence. And this third term is the lived body. Now, it is absolutely critical that we understand this is not the body you see on anatomy charts, that biological machine. This is the body as we actually experience it, from the inside out. It's our very medium for being in the world, the vehicle of our existence. The lived body reveals to us, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, an ambiguous mode of existing. He calls it a being of two leaves. What a great image, right? On the one hand, your body is a physical thing out there in the world. It can be seen, it can be touched, but at the very same time, it is the perspective from which you see and touch. It completely escapes those neat Cartesian boxes because it's both a subject and an object all at once. Okay, so how does this ambiguous third term actually function to weave us so tightly into the world? Well, the key mechanism here is what Merleau-Ponty calls the intentional arc. Now, this arc isn't some physical thing. I want you to think of it more like the way our bodily knowledge, our whole history of skills, our I can, is dynamically projected out onto our surroundings. It's the thing that weaves our past experiences into the present moment, creating a meaningful, livable world around us, instead of just a chaotic collection of raw data. So let's break this down a bit. First, our body acts as this living reservoir for all our acquired skills. You know, how to walk, how to type, how to drive a car. Second, this intentional arc projects that embodied history onto the world around us. And third, and this is the payoff, as a result of that projection, the world doesn't appear to us as a neutral geometric space. Instead, it appears as a field of what phenomenologists call solicitations or affordances, things that call out to our body, that invite certain actions. And this just illustrates the idea perfectly. You don't just see a path. Even if your mind is a million miles away, your body understands it as walkable. You don't just see a mug, your hand already feels it. It already knows how to form the perfect grip. This is a pre-reflective, practical understanding that happens through the body, completely bypassing any need for conscious intellectual calculation. Okay, but here's where it gets really, really interesting. This isn't just a one-way street, with a body projecting meaning out onto a passive world. The crucial next step in Merleau-Ponty's thought is that the world acts back. It touches back. And to capture this profound reversibility, Merleau-Ponty uses the term chiasm, which just means a crossing over, like the shape of an X. This is the point where the distinction between the perceiver and the perceived just collapses. The body and the world become so deeply intertwined that they form a single fabric, which he poetically calls the flesh. This is captured so beautifully in a quote from his work, I and Mind. Merleau-Ponty writes that, because your body is itself a visible thing, your act of seeing isn't something a disembodied mind does to the world. It's an event that happens within the visible. You, the seer, are irrevocably part of the scenery you're looking at. And this leads to a fundamental reversibility at the very core of our experience. The moment you touch something, you are, by absolute necessity, being touched by it. The moment you see the world, you are also, at that same moment, an object in that world, capable of being seen. You are, as he says, installed in the midst of the visible. So this creates this continuous dialectic, this back and forth. The body and the world aren't just causally linked, like a cue ball hitting an 8-ball. They are conceptually inseparable. You literally cannot understand one without the other. They're two sides of the very same coin of experience. So what's the ultimate implication here? Where does this radical intertwining leave us, philosophically speaking? Well, if we really accept this, if we're not separate minds peering out at an external world but are truly interwoven with it, then the entire classical problem of how the mind represents reality, it just sort of dissolves. We no longer need to invent an internal picture, a mental map, to explain how we manage to get around in the world. As the phenomenologist Hubert Dreyfus so perfectly put it, the best representation of the world is the world itself. Our access isn't mediated by thought or internal models. Our access is direct, it's immediate, and it happens through the body's ongoing, skillful dialogue with its environment. And so we end on this question, and it's one I really want you to carry with you. Because this isn't just some abstract point for philosophers to debate in journals. This is a fundamental reframing of who we are. I want you to consider this for our next discussion. If you are not a mind that is simply in your body, but you are your body, how does that change everything?
Well, I will argue that Merleau-Ponty's framework brilliantly and accurately resolves that dualism by providing a new, absolutely necessary ontological category that perfectly maps onto our lived experience.
And I will argue that this third term relies on an ontological ambiguity that merely renames the mind-body problem without actually scientifically solving it.
Fair enough. Let's get into it. Traditional philosophy has essentially given us only two options for existing. We exist either as a conscious subject, which is the pure thinking mind, or as an object, which is physical matter.
The stark pencil line between the apple and the table.
Precisely. Merleau-Ponty looks at human experience and realizes this binary is utterly insufficient to explain how we actually live. So he introduces the lived body as a third term. He calls the body a being of two leaves.
Meaning?
Think of it this way. On one hand, your body is a thing among things. It takes up physical space, it has weight, it can be seen and touched by others. But on the exact same hand, it is a very entity that does the seeing and touching.
Right.
Through what he calls the intentional art. Our bodily skills and our sedimented past experiences physically project meaning into the space around us. This proves that the body and the world are conceptually inseparable. If you are listening to this and wondering if this is just a poetic evasion of hard science, I assure you it is not. I believe this is the most accurate, rigorous scientific description of our lived reality that philosophy has ever produced.
I mean, I readily acknowledge the descriptive brilliance of Merleau-Ponty's Practonosia. His psychological account of how we practically navigate the world is practically unparalleled.
But
But I maintain deep skepticism about his ontological conclusions. For phenomenology to function as a rigorous science, it requires definitional precision. And as Merleau-Ponty moves into his later works, he frankly abandons that precision.
I don't think he abandons it at all.
Oh, come on. To claim that the body and the world are made of the same stuff, what he nebulously terms the flesh of the world, it risks collapsing his entire project into an obscure monism.
Well, define what you mean by that for our discussion.
An obscure monism, meaning a system where everything just blurs into one giant, undifferentiated blob of reality. Where does the subject end and the object begin? If everything is just flesh, we lose the ability to differentiate.
I see.
I am drawing here on the critique by Mark B. N. Hansen, who points out that making bodily movement fundamental might actually leave the consciousness world dualism completely intact.
How so?
Because the body continues to be defined primarily by its correlation with consciousness, it introduces a murky opacity to the conversation, but it doesn't solve the underlying structural divide. I know many of our students reading the text find the jargon of the chiasm and the flesh deeply frustrating, and you have every right to. It operates much more like literature than rigorous philosophical science.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on how structural this actually is. We need to slow down and look at Merleau-Ponty's most famous anatomical example, the right hand touching the left hand.
Ah, the famous two hands.
Right. Right now, if you are listening, I want you to literally hold out your left hand. Now take your right hand and touch your left palm. Feel what is happening. Your right hand is acting as the subject. It is doing the exploring, feeling the texture and temperature of the skin.
And your left hand is the object being touched.
Exactly. But in a fraction of a second, you can flip your attention. Suddenly, your left hand becomes the subject, feeling the pressure of the right hand pressing into it.
It is a fascinating sensory loop, yes.
It is a closed circuit of perception. Now think of it mechanistically, like a Mobius strip. You know that twisted loop of paper where the inside and outside are the same surface?
Right.
If you trace the surface of the subject side of your hand, you seamlessly cross over into the object side without ever lifting your pencil. The inside and the outside are continuous. This reversibility fundamentally bridges the gap between the perceiver and the perceived.
But does it bridge it completely?
Yes, you don't have a conscious mind trapped inside a meat machine, looking out at an alien world through windows. You have a body that is of the exact same fabric as the world, turning back on itself to perceive itself.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered a crucial caveat hidden right there in Merleau-Ponty's own text?
Which caveat?
If we look very closely at the visible and the invisible, he admits something vital about this reversibility. He writes that this flip between subject and object is always imminent and never realized in fact.
He does say that, yes. The coincidence is never total.
Right. He specifies that the left hand is always on the verge of touching the right hand, touching the things, but I never reach actual perfect coincidence. The coincidence eclipses at the exact moment of realization.
You can feel one hand touching or the other being touched, but never perfectly both at the exact same intellectual millisecond. So I have to ask, how can a failed coincidence serve as the foundation of a unified ontology?
It's not a failure, though.
Well, if the Mobius strip is actually broken, if the subject-object coincidence constantly escapes us, then the gap remains. The pencil line between the apple and the table is still there, even if he has drawn it very, very faintly.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The fact that the coincidence is never fully realized is exactly the point. It is not a failure of his system. It is the mechanical engine of perception itself.
Go on.
Merleau-Ponty calls this the fundamental divergence, or the écart. Think about it. If your hands completely coincided, if subject and object collapsed into pure undifferentiated identity, there would be no perception at all.
Because you'd be a closed loop.
Exactly. You would be a completely closed, static system, like a rock resting on another rock. The fact that the body is slightly out of phase with itself, that it diverges, is what opens up the necessary space for the world to appear.
I see what you're saying, but
Moving oneself means being slightly out of phase with oneself. The gap isn't a massive Cartesian abyss between two entirely different substances of mind and matter. It is just a fold in a single fabric.
I come at it from a different way. Let's look at the historical context here. Because Merleau-Ponty frames this entire endeavor as overcoming Descartes. But did he really?
I'd argue he absolutely did.
Well, if we go back to Descartes' letters to Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, Descartes himself realized the strict mind-body dualism of his meditations had major limits when it came to explaining human action.
Sure, he acknowledged the union.
Right, he established a third primitive notion, the mind-body union. Descartes explicitly argued that this union could not be known by pure intellect, nor by imagination, but only clearly by the senses. When Merleau-Ponty introduces the lived body as a third term that escapes the categories of pure mind and pure matter, we must seriously ask if he is merely offering a phenomenological rebranding of what Descartes already conceded centuries earlier.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it conflates two radically different architectural structures of reality.
How so?
Yes, Descartes offered a third primitive notion, but he still viewed the mind-body union as an interaction between two completely distinct substances. He literally hypothesized a transitive action happening via the pineal gland in the brain.
Well, the biology was flawed, yes.
But the structure was flawed. It's an engineering solution. Gear A turns gear B. The invisible mind pulls a lever and the physical arm moves. Merleau-Ponty's flesh is definitively not a union of two substances taped together. He explicitly warns against thinking of flesh starting from body and spirit, because then it would just be the union of contradictories.
So what is it then?
He calls it an element, in the classical sense, like water or air. It's a general manner of being.
But this is exactly where the requirement for a mechanism comes in. How does an element actively navigate the complex physical world without slipping back into a causal interaction?
To understand the mechanism, look at the football field example from our source text, which beautifully illustrates the intentional arc.
Okay, let's look at the football field.
For the skilled player in the middle of a fast-paced game, the field is not an external object interacting with a calculating mind. The player isn't a subject doing conscious geometry, calculating distances and vectors to the goal.
Right, they aren't mapping it out intellectually.
No, the field is pervaded with what Merleau-Ponty calls lines of force. The openings between adversaries, the boundaries of the penalty area, these lines of force call for a certain mode of action and guide the player completely unreflectively.
But how? What is the actual mechanism of a field calling to a person?
It is the intentional arc. The player's body has sedimented thousands of hours of past experiences, drills, and muscle memory directly into their nervous system. The body stores this knowledge.
Okay.
So when a gap opens up in the defense, the brain doesn't need to process a thought that says, run there. The physical body recognizes an opportunity it has successfully navigated before. And the gap literally looks like an invitation to sprint.
And you think that entirely bypasses causality?
Yes, because the player and the milieu form a circular dialectic. The player's movement alters the phenomenal field, which in turn instantly alters the player's next movement. There is no pineal gland translating a mental strategy into a physical muscle twitch. The consciousness is the dialectic of the environment and the action.
I am glad you brought up the football analogy because it highlights exactly where people hit a wall with the scientific validity of this paradigm.
You think the analogy fails?
I think when a reader tries to systematize this, to understand the precise mechanism of how a line of force calls to a body without cognitive representation, Merleau-Ponty's language becomes deliberately evasive.
Evasive? How?
In Phenomenology of Perception, when describing the relations between decision and the body and movement, he actually describes them as magic ones.
He is trying to violently shake us out of our mechanistic, computer-like thinking.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Shaking us out of bad habits is fine for poetry, but we are trying to establish a rigorous science here.
It is a rigorous science.
In another passage, he talks about a pre-established harmony, where the lighting knows and sees the object. Look, when you're trying to establish phenomenology as a rigorous foundation for the sciences, invoking magic or claiming that the ambient lighting knows things is deeply problematic.
I disagree.
It abandons the systematic, structural observation required of a real science. It relies on a marvelous ambiguity. It reads beautifully, but when you poke it for a structural mechanism, you hit a cloud of metaphors. How can we possibly call this a science?
Because the ambiguity is not a failure of Merleau-Ponty's writing. The ambiguity is a hyper-accurate reflection of the phenomenon itself. Human existence is an inherently ambiguous mode of existence.
But science demands clarity.
The relentless demand for a structural mechanism is exactly the Cartesian hangover Merleau-Ponty is trying to cure us of. You are looking for gears and levers in human behavior where there simply are none.
I'm looking for functional explanations.
But if the lived experience of finding a maximal grip on our environment, like the football player spontaneously cutting through a defense, defies linear causality, then forcing it into clear-cut Cartesian boxes would be the true scientific failure. It would be falsifying the raw data of human experience to fit a predetermined hypothesis.
But doesn't the very nature of science require us to formalize the data, to draw distinctions? If everything is just a porous, intertwined flesh, how do we categorize anything at all?
We categorize it phenomenologically. Yes, the jargon is unconventional, and yes, I know our students find it frustrating to read, but it is unconventional because it is doing the incredibly heavy lifting of inventing an entirely new language for something we've ignored for centuries.
The lived body.
Exactly. Merleau-Ponty refers to the body as an interiorly worked-over mass. Prior philosophy literally had no words for this because it assumed the body was just a dumb machine. The scientific rigor of phenomenology lies in its absolute fidelity to the phenomenon exactly as it appears, not as we wish it would neatly divide.
Right.
The intentional arc explains how meaning is generated in our daily life without relying on a hidden mental homunculus sitting in the brain pulling strings.
I concede that the rejection of the mental homunculus is essential, and motor intentionality does that brilliantly. It proves the body is an active, meaning-endowing subject. But let's return to the concept of the flesh and intercorporeity.
Okay.
Merleau-Ponty wants to say that because my two hands can touch each other and belong to one body, I can extrapolate that my body and the world, or my body and another person's body, belong to one universal flesh.
Yes, the chiasm extends outward.
And that is a massive ontological leap. It goes from a verifiable psychological description of how I experience my own sensory loop to a metaphysical claim about the grand fabric of the universe.
It is a leap, but it is a leap strictly supported by the evidence of perception itself. Think about the basic act of vision. For me to see the world, I must be visible.
Obviously.
I must be situated within the visual field. I cannot see a tree unless the light hitting the tree also hits my physical eye. Therefore, the world and I share a visual consistency. I am not an invisible phantom hovering over reality, taking notes on a clipboard. I am installed right in the thick midst of the visible.
A palpation with the look.
Exactly. He says vision is a palpation with the look, because I am made of the same physical stuff as the world, Because I have mass, dimension, and visibility, my body can act as a resonator for the qualities of the world. Color, depth, and light awaken a direct echo in our physical bodies.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that it still leaves the exact boundary between self and world troublingly vague?
Vague in what sense?
If I am just a fold in the universal flesh of the world, where does my personal agency begin and the world's solicitation end? Going back to the football field, Merleau-Ponty himself admits that in this dialectic of action, finally, one cannot say if it is the look or if it is the things that command.
That's the dialectic.
But if a phenomenological science cannot even theoretically distinguish between the stimulus and the response, or the agent and the environment, it risks losing its explanatory power entirely. It becomes purely descriptive, and honestly, descriptively poetic at that.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. What you call a loss of explanatory power is actually the discovery of a much deeper truth about human agency.
Which is?
True agency is not a sovereign, isolated decree issued by a lonely mind. It is always a response. It is a dialogue with your environment. And the boundary is vague because the boundary is dynamic. Think about the mechanism of learning to drive a car.
Okay.
Steering wheel, you look at the pedals, you calculate the pressure needed, but as you gain a maximal grip on the skill of driving, the car becomes part of your lived body.
Right. We discussed this with the cane.
Yes. You don't feel the steering wheel anymore. You literally feel the road through the tires, just as you feel the texture of an apple through your fingers. The boundary of yourself has functionally expanded to include 2 tons of steel. Merleau-Ponty's framework handles this fluidity perfectly, whereas Cartesian dualism simply breaks down and calls it a mystery.
It handles the fluidity of the experience, yes, and I want to be entirely clear that, as a descriptive methodology, Merleau-Ponty's work is an absolute triumph.
It really is.
He captures the nuanced, lived reality of the human condition better than almost anyone in the history of philosophy. But my concern remains grounded in the foundational aspirations of phenomenology itself. Husserl wanted phenomenology to be the rigorous science of all sciences, grounded in transcendental subjectivity.
And Merleau-Ponty evolved that.
By trading that clarity for the magic of flesh and the chiasm, he creates a beautiful existentialism, but he sacrifices the definitional precision required to definitively bury Cartesian dualism once and for all. We are left with a lingering consciousness-world dualism that is just cloaked in the beautiful language of intertwining.
And I must fiercely disagree with that conclusion. Merleau-Ponty's intertwining fundamentally achieves what it sets out to do precisely because it refuses to artificially sever the knot of existence just to make the math easier.
Math is what makes it a science, though.
But human life is a math. He elevates the body from a mechanical object to an active, meaning-endowing subject. He proves that perception and physical movement are simply 2 sides of the body's fundamental divergence from itself. The I can is deeply, inextricably intertwined with the world's affordances. To call it mere poetry is to dismiss the profound, painstaking rigor required to articulate the ambiguous truth of how we actually live.
Well, I think we have arrived at the core tension that makes studying phenomenology so deeply rewarding for our class.
I agree.
There is an ongoing, vibrant struggle here between the philosophical demand for rigorous, clean categorization and the inherently ambiguous, messy reality of lived experience. Merleau-Ponty offers us an unparalleled lens into our motor intentionality and our skillful coping, even if the ontological leap to the flesh leaves us with profound, lingering questions about where the world ends and we begin.
Absolutely. And there's vastly more to explore in the visible and the invisible regarding this intertwining. We have only scratched the surface of how the chiasm applies to language, to history, and to how we perceive other human beings.
There's a lot left.
We strongly encourage all of you listening to return to the source text and grapple with these concepts for yourselves. See how they map onto your own lived experience.
Indeed. Read the text. Test it against your own perception. Do the experiment with your hands. Pay attention when you drive your car. Decide for yourself if this unconventional language obscures the scientific truth or if it finally illuminates it.
It is the difference between insisting the world is a simple drawing with stark black pencil lines and accepting that it is a complex, breathing painting where the colors of the body and the world bleed into one another. The boundary is porous, and perhaps that is exactly where all the meaning of human existence actually happens. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next week for part 5.